So that is the goal for today. And I believe where we left off is we finished talking about some of the philosophies. Um, so we talked about the mind-body problem. We talked about the nature of human beings, whether we're good or evil. We talked about how much of our personality and who we are due to nature versus nurture. Um, and again, what I would emphasize at this point, at least from a cultural perspective, is we haven't found a society who has not wondered about these questions yet. Hence, most societies have a sense of spirituality or religion, a sense of wondering about the capacities of human beings and how we could proceed and be successful in our world. And so these questions are asked by different cultures all over the world. But what we're going to see is sometimes the way that they're answered, the way they're approached, are very culturally based. Okay, so we'll see those topics come up again, um, and we will see that culture does really have an influence on how we view these different things. Okay, what I'd like to cover today is just have a conversation about some of the general theories and approaches to understanding human behavior in psychology. Okay. Now, this I'm going to say again, just like with the philosophy part, we're going to get a very truncated version of this. So, if you find these topics interesting, I'll make sure that we have some resources put on in our canvas so you can explore them more. And we're not going to go over all of them. There's still some other areas of and theories of psychology that we'll actually get to when we're more topic specific. Okay, but these are kind of some overarching kind of theories that have been developed over since over the last about 200 years. Okay. Um, and the one thing that I would encourage you to think about while we're going through this is, as stated, I think last Thursday, psychology has been steep into kind of Western ideas, Western theory, Western science, and how we approach understanding human nature and human behavior. And so I would encourage you to kind of look at how culture probably influenced a lot of these theories and how these theories have influenced culture, as we will see. Okay, so let's begin. Last Thursday, we left off with Wilhelm Wundt and William James, if you remember, and they gave us the ideas of structuralism versus functionalism. And they both promoted the idea that we should approach studying the mind from a scientific perspective. Okay. One thought it was more important to study what the function of something is, and the other one felt that it was more about the structure. Okay. But one of our first really formalized theory kind of came out of the Wilhelm Wundt camp of structuralism. Okay. And this one of our very first theories, comes from someone that I think everyone relates to psychology. You think psychology, most people think of this person, and that's Sigmund Freud. Okay. Um, to give you just a little bit of background on Sigmund Freud, okay, is he was influenced mainly by German science, and so Wilhelm Wundt's ideas of structures and those kinds of things were very much part of his educational journey. He was actually not trained as a psychiatrist. He really had no interest in actually going into medicine and the profession. Okay. He was trained as a pretty serious neuroscientist. In fact, his doctoral dissertation was on something like the nervous system of a frog, something like that. Okay. But because he was Jewish, he wasn't allowed to be part of the scientific and academic societies at the time. Okay. So he was forced to hang up his science jacket and put on a doctor jacket. Okay. And he put up a shingle, and because he was in neurology, he practiced neurology as his practice, which included anything from, if there's not a physiological explanation for someone's pain, what's the process going on that is causing it, to things like mental illnesses. Okay. And at that time, the main mental illness that most psychiatrists were worried about. I just lost the name of it. Um, Hysteria. Hysteria was the main disorder that him and his colleagues were thought out to be. Hysteria, to just kind of give this some cultural bearing, okay? Hysteria comes from the word hysta, or the female sexual organs, okay? And so hysterectomy is the removal of the female sexual organs, right? Hysteria as a disease is kind of the same thing. What they felt was happening with a person, mainly 99% women, who were brought to the psychiatrist by their father or their husband, because that's the only way a woman could get treatment then. They felt that what was making her quote unquote crazy, hysterical, have emotional outbursts, is that her womb was wandering around in her body and creating havoc. Okay, hence we have the term hysteria or hysterical. Okay. Um, so that was one of the main disorders that Freud and a person he worked with, Bruner, worked with the most. Okay. Um, and what happened though is the famous Anna O case of Bruner, who Freud was just a consultant with, came to Bruner, and she, if this is probably an exaggeration or just a fairy tale, went to Bruner and says, "I'm referring all of my friends to you." And he's like, "Well, why? You come and we just sit and we just talk." And she goes, "After every time I come talk to you, I feel better. And I don't feel my symptoms for 3 or 4 weeks. And then I come back and see you again, and I'm okay for another 3 or 4 weeks." Okay. And so Bruner and Sigmund Freud got together and they started to look at this idea of talk therapy, the idea of that a person can come in and just express their emotions, and by doing that, they're releasing something that is curative for them. Okay, so they called this the talking cure, which in modern times, again, how culture influences, this is what we would consider professionalized counseling psychotherapy today. So the roots start with Bruner and Freud. Okay. But Freud needed to have a theory to make it understand why a person needs someone else in order to figure out what's wrong with them. Okay. And so he proposed this idea that, that what really drives a lot of people's lives, both good and bad, but especially dysfunction, is unconscious drives. Okay. That there must be something that is underneath our awareness, that without someone who has some type of specialized training to understand those unconscious things that are going through our mind, that we just don't know why we act the way we do. Okay. And that's how he comes to the conclusion. That's why the talking cure works, because that other person is accessing parts of that person's mind that they originally didn't have access to. Okay. So Freud needed to explain, though, well, what are the drives and what is making us do what we do? And he had to come up with this argument that we all humans must possess similar drives. We have to have very similar drives because humans can be successful regard the way humans have been. We can pretty much almost inhabit the whole earth except for some very extreme places. Okay. So he argued that we all must have some basic primitive drives. And this is where he is going to use what was a very famous theory back then, which was evolutionary theory. Okay. And he's going to come up with this argument that our unconscious mind came from this premortal drives that we all have and then evolved into our more modern day mental world. Okay. And so he kind of was wondering, well, what two basic drives should all human beings have? Okay. And he argued that we should have what's known in Greek terms, eros, life, phantos, death. We must have a life and death instinct because those are really some of the only guarantees we have in the world is we can grow and develop and partner up and have children and produce life. And we all will definitely die someday. Okay. So he felt that these were the two drives that drive the human condition and drive our mental world. But those are kind of broad. Okay. What physiological things are related to Eros and Thanatos that then could explain the biology of our driven world? Okay. Well, again, he reduced Eros to our sex drive because it is sexuality that then leads to reproduction and life. And he reduced Thanatos to our aggressive tendencies, our needs to protect our territory, those kinds of things, and to aggress towards one another. Okay. So you can see some very kind of interesting flavors of how this is going to play out, right? So with this, and we're not going to get into this conversation right at this moment, but when we get to comparing development and human development, we'll come back to Freud and talk about his ideas of human development because most of what dysfunction grows out of, according to Freud, was trauma that occurred in early childhood. Okay. But let's get back to the basic notion of his unconscious ideas. Okay. So what he believed is that human beings because if you could imagine, if we only had a sex and aggression drive, okay, and that was the only thing that was driving our human behavior, okay, what Freud would argue, not Dr. Peterson, what Freud would argue is if we came in a classroom together, everyone would be trying to have sex with everyone else and beating up the person next to them, okay? That would be what our world would be if there wasn't some type of mechanism to control our primitive drives. Okay. Now, I know some of you wish it was that way. No, I'm kidding. But that's basically what Freud would say. So, what did the id, which is the house of the primitive drives, do? It developed something called the ego. Okay. The ego operates on what's known as the reality principle. It's the only part of our unconscious that has access to the external world. And it's kind of like our executive branch. It looks to what is appropriate here to be here, but still increase our chances of satisfying those drives at a later time. And so the ego, along with our social world, develop rules of ways to interact with each other, all of those kinds of things, so that we can survive and actually survive as a species. Okay. But the ego also understood, and again, if we take this into historical context, this is happening during time in the United States where everyone was very closed off, everyone dressed, um, the suits and ties and all of those kinds of things, and everyone were kind of prudish, very prudish time, especially in the European countries. Okay. And so, what Freud, again, based on his time and place he was in, also developed something called the superego. Okay. The superego was just an extra layer of protection uh, so that our aggression and sex drives didn't overtake the ego. Okay. The superego operates on what's called the moral principle or what one ought to do in a given situation. Okay. And again, it's not a pleasurable thing. You don't, I wouldn't, in Freud terms, don't equate morality to pleasure or happiness. Morality for Freud is perfection, acting humanly perfectionist in every situation. Okay. Which later, again, we won't get into this in this class. That's what leads to compulsive behaviors and OCD and all of those kinds of things, is the superego has taken over the unconscious world. Okay, so this is the structures of our mind. We have an id with our two primitive drives. We have our ego that acts as an executive or a mediator between those drives and the external world. And they have a helper known as a superego that kind of is this encouragement to act as if one should act. Okay. Um, and all of these things are what really drives human behavior. Okay. Now, there's some qualities to this theory that we should note. One, it is what we call a deterministic theory. Okay, meaning that we didn't choose to be where we're at. Okay. If Freud was here today, he wouldn't say, I'm going to pick on my students here on campus that you all aren't here with the cool glasses, the awesome hair, the kind of the scarf and the watch and stuff like that and whatnot because you want to learn here or that you want to just be here. And no, what Freud would argue is you think you're doing that, but what you're doing is increasing your odds of sex or aggression at a later time. Okay. You're withholding gratification. Now, what do you think about that? Right? It's a little, and so that's where Freud's theory gets a little strange.
So like
Okay.
it increases our chances of reproduction
Later on. Yeah.
later on.
Yeah.
Okay, nice.
Yeah. So, but what Freud argues, though, is that therefore we don't choose, we don't determine our own fates. Our fates are determined by these unconscious structures that have already been at play for quite a while. Okay. Hence, in the treatment modality, you need some type of professional trained in psychoanalysis to really dig down and figure out why it is your unconscious is driving you to do and be what you are today. Okay. All right. Again, culturally, we'll come back to Freud throughout the semester because he did have some influences that we should note. But I want to talk just a little bit about, do we have an unconscious world? Okay. The answer is yes. All right. If you look at the best example is if you look at the sensory systems, most sensory systems don't go directly to your higher cortical areas of your brain. They actually make a pit stop in the limbic system, which is something we really don't have conscious access to unless that information is transmitted up into the higher cortical areas of the brain. Okay. The reason why those sensory systems go through the limbic system, we think, is because sometimes in life we need an immediate response to something. Okay. If someone is being aggressive towards you, you don't want to have to sit there with your cortex wondering why he's swinging arms at you or why they're yelling at you. No, you need an immediate emotional protective response. Okay. So that information is sent to the limbic system to prepare you for action. Okay. And then I think it's about a 1.5 to 2 second delay that then it is sent up to the higher cortical areas of the brain where you have a conscious reality of it, where you go, oh, this is what's going on. Um, the best example of how sometimes consciousness and unconsciousness work is if anyone ever wanted to just slap someone, like they just annoyed you, and and your hand was like up there, or your fist was ready, and you were in the stance, maybe, where you were down here crunching your, okay, we're going to go at this. But then all of a sudden you start to think, oh no, the consequences. Oh, what if I get in trouble? Oh, what? And you'll feel yourself kind of cool down and you released your fist. Okay. That's this process. Okay. Something about that situation was reacting your limbic system, and your limbic system was getting in fight or flight because it felt something dangerous. Okay. But then that information was sent up to the higher cortical areas of your brain, where then you kind of took control of that emotional response. Okay. So that's kind of in modern terms, if we talk about consciousness, unconsciousness, those are kind of the things we look at. We get into things like priming effect, um, and those kinds of things that really drive our behavior. Okay, which we'll get to some really interesting studies when we look at morality cross culture. It's really kind of some cool stuff about what does make us act moral. It's kind of interesting. So that's Freud. And I will tell you a lot of his theory, even though he did base it, wanted it to be based in science, he based it in evolutionary theory. The issue with Freud's theory is it's what's known as a circular theory. Okay. Why did you behave the way you did? Because the id and ego said that's what was going to happen. Well, could you have had control of it? And then no, the id or the ego wouldn't allow me. So, so it's not testable under current scientific protocols. You can't test Sigmund Freud's theory. You can't really locate that thing we call the id or the ego. So one of the issues with Freud's theory is that, and the controversies, is because it's not really testable to scientific standards. However, the reason we still look at it is one, it's one of our first theories, and it has driven a lot of other investigations, such as the one I just explained with the limbic system and the cortical area. And we do realize that there are things that drive our behavior that occur on an unconscious or a subconscious level. And we will see that cultural influences tend to work a lot at that level. Okay. All right. So the next two camps, one started around 1913, and the other one's going to be a response to psychoanalysis and to this movement here. And this is what's known as what was called the behaviorist movement, which was not a worldwide movement. If you want an American psychology, the behaviorist movement is like the quintessential, this was American made, American done. Okay. Um, the behaviorist movement, John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner are kind of the poster childs of this. John Watson is considered the father of behaviorism. B.F. Skinner is really that poster child of behaviorism. They're going to do a couple things. Is they felt that Freud's theory was taking us back into philosophy and not science. And they felt psychology should be more like the natural sciences and not, the social sciences of the day. And what they argued is like the natural science, we should only study those things we can directly observe. Okay. And at this time, what can we directly observe? We can directly observe a stimulus in the environment and the response of an organism or species. Okay. Those are the only two things, meaning anything in between that, any mental processes and whatnot, they said don't matter. In fact, B.F. Skinner is going to say your consciousness is just a byproduct of stimulus response associations. Okay. Um, and so this is kind of the movement that we're going to go into of reward and punishment, those types of things. And I just, I got to give these guys a little bit of justice in this area because they did have a huge influence on parenting and parents' attitudes today. Okay. So let me kind of explain this. John B. Watson is his most famous study is the little Albert experiments. Okay. The little Albert experiments is where Watson wanted to prove that fear was conditioned. It's not something we're born with, that we learn fear. Okay. So he took an infant. He wanted to use an infant because the infant didn't have any experience, right? And he put the infant in front of dangerous things like fire and all that kind of thing. And they observed the baby would still try to approach it and do what babies do and put it in their mouth and all that kind of stuff. The main stimulus was a little white rat. Okay. And they put the white rat, and little Albert got curious, would pick it up again, that age, tried to put it in his mouth and played with it. Didn't have a fear response whatsoever. Okay. But then Watson paired the appearance of the white rat with a loud startle bang behind his head, which would make him startle. And eventually, what happened is that little Albert had a startle effect and a fear response with just the white rat. Okay. And not only the white rat, he did something called generalization, meaning that he ended up having fears of everything white and furry. Okay. Regardless of whether it was a rat or a bunny or a white pillow, soft pillow. Okay. So this was kind of Watson's proof or idea that life is conditioned, fears are conditioned. We learn these things. Okay. But Watson, well, he while he was doing the little Albert experiments, and I can't remember her name right now, I apologize. He ended up having an affair with his graduate assistant that he was doing the experiment with. And the college was like, yeah, no, you know what? That's not cool. And so they said, either you uh, stop your affair, have her transferred to another department, or and go back to your wife, or stay with your wife, I should say. He didn't leave her. Or you quit. Okay. Well, Watson quit. Okay. He's like, uh-uh. Now, I feel really bad for his wife. And don't get me wrong, that's not something cool to do to somebody. But if there is a case for true love, Watson and the student got married, lived a very, very loving life their whole entire life. She actually died 10 years before him, and he isolated himself in the house in a deep, deep depression, in alcoholism and everything else because he lost her. So, maybe he made the right life choice, but I'm not saying that. But why am I telling the story? Well, one has to do with love can last. But the other one is what Watson did after leaving university because he actually became very wealthy in two areas of the world, parenting and marketing. He was one of the first to write a parent book based on behaviorism, which, if you want to think about this in modern American families, who do we put the onus of responsibility for a child's development on? The parent. Why? Because they provide the stimulus response for their child to act appropriately or not act appropriately. So in his parenting book, he put one, punishment's cool, go for it. Reward, very good, but it's up to you. Your child will turn out to be who they are based upon your response to them. Okay. And I want you to think about modern America when we see children who are not acting appropriate or they get involved in criminal behavior. Who do we instantly start to blame? The family, the parents, the mom, especially the mom. And so this idea, though, that it's completely the parent comes from that original parenting book that Watson did. Okay. Because both Watson and Skinner, especially Skinner, actually developed. So you see in this picture, these are what's called pigeon boxes. This is what B.F. Skinner used to train pigeons based on lights and those kinds of things. And he actually built a child-size pigeon box. Okay. And he was going to put children in it because he said, bring me your child. Tell me what you want them to be, an attorney, a garbage man, a teacher, a president, and I will use the principles of conditioning to make it so your child doing that. And he was going to do it in that controlled environment of a child box. You can see these on the internet. They're crazy looking. Fortunately, uh, Child and Family Services got involved, said, no, you can't do that. Skinner said, well, I'll use my own children. And they said, no, you're not going to do that. So no child was ever put in one of these boxes and trained, thank God. But anyways, but that's the extreme level is they felt that it's totally the onus of the parent to develop their child. If your child does not turn out right, it's because of you and your bad parenting. Okay. And if you think about the American mentality, that is one of the thought processes we have with children and their behavior. Okay. All right. Beyond that, what did Watson do? Watson went into marketing, and one of his first marketing things is he was hired by a coffee company to increase their sales because at the time a lot of competition was starting to come in the coffee world. Okay. At the time, it was a belief in marketing and in business that in order to increase your sales, you have to increase the quality of your product. Okay. Watson kind of disagreed with that, though. He goes, I don't think we need to change the quality. I just think we need to change the packaging. Okay. So he set up these test things, Coke and Pepsi challenge and see if you know which one is one, something like that. And he had one coffee with the plain coffee can name of the place. And then he had one that was a really fancy coffee can. Okay. Same exact coffee. And he would do taste tests and say, which coffee do you think tastes best? And the majority of people, even though it was the exact same coffee, would pick the fancy packaging one because they assumed that that was a better product. Okay. Placebo effect. We talked about that earlier. Okay. Um, and so what he really did for the marketing world and what made him very wealthy is he says, hey, you don't need to change your product. You don't need to make a better product. You just need to make it look more appealing. Okay. I call this the macaroni and cheese phenomenon. Most people swear that Kraft macaroni and cheese is way better than the generic, right? But if you go down the aisle where they're both setting and look at a bunch of the back of the boxes, they come from the same manufacturer. So, so it's not that Kraft is a better product, it's they have better packaging. Something to think about, even though I prefer Kraft over generic anyways, but I'm not going to change my mind on that, but I do know they're the exact same thing. Okay. But that's what he kind of showed, and that's how he influenced marketing. I will tell you, I'll leave this just kind of as a side note with B.F. Skinner. He was also one of the very first to design a precision bomb. Okay. What he did is he taught a pigeon to peck at the target that the bomb needed to go to, and that would direct the rocket to the target or the bomb. Okay. Interestingly, this is again going back to how strange morals are in this world. Um, there was such outrage by the idea of blowing up a pigeon that it was never implemented. But okay, we're not going to blow up a pigeon, but we're going to kill hundreds of people with a bomb. But no one had moral conundrums about that. Something to think about when we consider these kinds of things. Maybe it's because we took away the free will of the pigeon. I don't know. Anyways, but our first precision bomb was actually done by a behaviorist in psychology. Kind of an interesting side note. Anyways, so again, this theory is a deterministic theory. Okay. Again, what the behaviorists would argue is you guys, like in the classroom and on Zoom, are not here because you want to become better people. You want to do something different in your life. You're here um, as a product of your learned history, of your reward and punishment history is what put you here, not your motivation to do something for yourself or to learn something or anything like that. No, behaviorists argue that that's a byproduct. That's just your brain making you feel like you're in control when you're not. Okay. So again, here we are with another thing that's is indicating you're not the free-willed person that you think you are. So in response to that, in the 1950s, a person named Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow came along, and they developed what is called the humanistic theory. Okay. Um, but the basis of this theory was to kind of bring back the idea of free will, that we make conscious choices and we have the ability to change those choices. Okay. But how are you going to develop this idea of free will? Well, during the 1950s, if you want to think about this, we're heading into the nuclear age. We're still in conflicts all over the globe. I believe we were there was a one war that was going on then. I can't remember what it was though. It was one before Vietnam, after World War II. Anyways, there was a war we were involved in there. We're in the nuclear bomb. There's a cold war starting to develop between Russia and Europe and all of those things. And so the world looked very chaotic. Okay. And a theory known as existentialism was kind of a way for people to make sense of the world. Okay. Because what existentialism states is that we're born into nothingness, we're born into chaos. There is no meaning to our existence, it has no purpose. Okay. So, what do humans do in order to bring meaning? We make meaning. Okay. So, we create things like religion, schools, societies, cultures, governments, um, um, utility departments, all of those things to provide our sense of world with meaning. Okay. And the humanistics are going to use this as the proof for free will, that if we're born into nothing, then we're making the choice to make something out of our life. Okay. And that's why when people say someone's having an existential crisis, they're at a part of their world where things just seem to be falling apart all around them, and they're coming to the realization that they need to change something. And that's kind of the basis of an existential crisis. Okay. So, what are Maslow and Rogers going to argue that every human being wants in their life? And they're going to argue that what we all want is something called self-actualization. Okay. We're going to define this a little bit better with Rogers here in a little while. But the basis of self-actualization is just a complete and total understanding of oneself. Okay. And Maslow, and you probably have all seen this sometime in your life, Maslow developed what was known as the hierarchy of needs. Okay. And of course, self-actualization is going to be here at the top. That what he's going to argue is that we need all of these needs to be in line in order for us to become self-actualized. Okay. And what are some of these needs? Well, at the base, we start with our biological needs. Okay, so we need food, water, shelter, all those kinds of things that allow us to biologically sustain ourselves. The second thing we need is we need to feel safe. We need to feel safe in the world, those kind of things. And then the third, we need human relationships. We need healthy, intimate relationships, relationships with family, community, those kinds of things. And then at the almost last level is esteem needs. We need to feel good about ourselves. Okay. And it's only when these things are aligned that then we can actually become self-actualized. Okay. And this is, again, these guys come from the treatment world, the therapy world, and what they're arguing is that our goal should to be to help people get all of these needs aligned so that they can overcome or they can become a better person. Okay. Um, and if you think about it, if you're going into counseling or social work or anything like this is the basis of a psychosocial history. What do we do when someone comes to our office? Well, they usually filled out something about whether they have a history of diabetes, heart disease, all of those biological things. They're asked, do they have food and whatnot? Do they feel safe in their house? Do they have histories of abuse? What is their relationships with their family and friends? And then we ask how they feel about themselves, right? And based upon all of that information, we then start a treatment plan to help them gain any of the needs that they might not have, okay? So that they could go on and be better, okay? Um, now, and we do find that when people don't have these needs taken care of, that they do have a very difficult time in life. Okay. So I do want to finish, though, our conversation about self-actualization with actual Carl Rogers' definition of self-actualization. Again, this is a simplified version, but he very much felt that we have what's known as our real self, and what is it called? Real self. An ideal self. Okay, got it. Okay. The ideal self is being the getting mom of the year, straight A's, 4.0 GPA, the best at your job, superstar, TikTok famous, um, any of those kinds of things that you think you should be. Okay. The real you is the person that exists right here and right now, just existing. Okay. And what Rogers believed is that an actualized person is when your real self and your ideal self are one and the same. Okay. That doesn't mean you become the TikTok famous star or you continue down the road you're going right now. No, what he argued is for those two things to be one and the same means that you have complete and total acceptance of both your good and your bad qualities. You accept the things that are good about you, you promote them, you work with them, and those things that are undesirable, you work on, but you don't deny them. Okay. You don't just say, no, I don't have a problem or something like that. And you don't put them in the back of your head. Okay. And this comes to then complete and total acceptance of oneself. Okay. Now, if you want to put this in terms of how many people could potentially become actualized, if you have complete and total acceptance of yourself, that allows you to see other people for their true self, for their good parts, their bad parts, all of those things, meaning that you are now living a life that is void of prejudice. Okay. Now, I want you to think about how many people, maybe, I can think Martin Luther King, maybe, Mother Teresa. I can think of a very few subsets of people that are probably that at that level of actualization, but that's what he argued for.
Yeah, I like to use his quotes all the time. The in order for change, you gotta accept yourself just as who you are.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Now, is there some evidence for this idea of these two selves? There actually is. Okay. When we measure what you think you should be and who you are, the wider apart those two things are, the higher amount of dysfunction we see. We see more severe depressive symptoms, more anxiety symptoms, higher probabilities of eating disorders, of substance use disorders. But the closer and closer and closer those two things can come together, the healthier the person tends to be. So there is evidence that we should pay attention to who we are and have acceptance for ourselves. Okay. But that is kind of the idea behind the humanistic movement is that we have to have these needs taken care of so that we can then explore who we are as a human being. So this kind of then bleeds into for our social workings, it seems like systems theory and all that, but we won't get into that. All right, so the last few things that I want to talk about is there's some other movements that kind of occurred during the same period of time, but they didn't really take off until later in the 1960s, and developmental psychology was more in the 80s and 90s where they really took off. But some other camps of psychology include social psychology, which after we talk about culture, we're going to talk about something called social cognition and talk about human biases and how, especially when we're stressed, we can have biased social perception, which leads to a lot of times the discrimination we see in our world or our misperceptions about people who are different than us. Okay. But social psychology is a study about the interaction between people and groups and how we influence each other, whether it's real or imagined. Okay. And one of the things that they have brought to light is do we, are our behaviors predictive of the situation we're in or our personality, our attitudes, and our beliefs? Okay. And where the current state is that we're actually more influenced by our situation than we are by our own attitudes, beliefs, and ideas. Okay. That the situation does have a lot of bearing on what we do. Now, where does the individual come into this? Well, most people will behave the same in a given situation. Okay. We all have a different perception of why we behaved a certain way. Okay. So if you think about like a dinner line, all right. Some people will be in that line because they're hungry, but they'll be in that line because it's not their turn to get the food yet. Some people just, it's a social appropriate thing. Other people just follow what everyone else is doing. We all may have this different ideas of why we stand in the meal line instead of just going and getting our food and not caring about the person next to us. Okay. So this is the other part of social psychology is while we can see humans do act similarly in a given situation, the reason for those actions can differ based on the person's personality and where they come from. So that's kind of their aspect. Okay. The other one, which is going to be a topic that we'll talk a lot about in this class, is developmental psychology. Developmental psychology is how we change cognitively, so our thought processes, socio-emotionally, our emotional reaction to the world, and biologically, our physical development, and how those changes over the lifespan influence our experience in the world. Okay. And so you could probably imagine that there's going to be a lot of cultural implications from parenting to even when someone goes through puberty, what's considered young adult and courtship. And all of those kinds of things tend to be heavily influenced by culture, as we will see. So, there's some cool things to talk about when we get to that. Okay. Now, as you can guess, we are not rats in a maze or pigeons in a box. So we don't always follow the rules of stimulus response associations. I would actually argue very few of us actually do. Um, and so what developed in the 1960s in response to behaviorism was what's called the cognitive revolution, where scientists said we can't ignore mental processes. Not only can we ignore them in humans, we need to look at other species. Okay. And in the other species thing is was uh, research by Tolman. Okay. Now he was a very famous psychologist, prestigious Berkeley faculty, all of these kinds of things. But I want you to imagine if you were just taking a tour of Berkeley and you poked in this window and you would see some famous psychologist, and he's pulling a little white rat in a little wagon around a room. That's all he's doing. You probably would go, is this really the prestigious place that I thought it was? Okay. But what he was doing was he was showing that you don't need reinforcement and punishment in order to teach a rat to go through a maze, that they can create a cognitive map of that space by just being taken through it. And they don't need trial and error, reward and punishment to figure it out. So he would pull them through that, and then he'd let them loose, and it would be like they were in the wagon and they'd go find their food. Okay. So on the animal end, that was kind of the first evidence that animals have a mental life too. Okay. And yes, further research shows that we all actually have cognitive maps. Believe it or not, you have specialized cells in your hippocampus just for your house, just for TOCC, just for your work, just for places you go. Okay. And those, every time you think about those are what start to fire. Okay. And if you've ever been so exhausted or so stressed and you go from like school to home, and you get home and you go, how the hell did I get here? Any of you guys have that experience or Zoom have that? That's because your cognitive map took over. It took you home. And that's an unconscious thing. Kind of a cool thing that we have that, luckily. I don't know where I'd end up if I didn't have that. But anyways, so that's one, the first evidence that we have a mental life that can override learning history. The second one was arguments within language. Okay. And again, language is going to be an important part of this class. Okay. Is that what the behaviorists believed is that we had to develop language through reward and punishment. Okay. I'm going to simplify this so that we can get on. The issue with that is if it was reward and punishment, the average child between the age of 0 and 6 will learn 30 to 60,000 words. That's a lot. But I don't know about you guys. I don't remember my mom saying good job 30 to 60,000 times or giving me a piece of candy 30 to 60,000 times because I said that word. And then I put them into combinations and you got even that many more rewards. Okay. So this kind of went to linguists, and they're like, no, we have to have some already native system that allows us to learn language. Okay. And so that too, and we'll get to it through the class, is another thing that kind of showed mental life is important. So, And then the 1980s with MRIs and whatnot, we got into brain scanning and the brain. Um, and then I'm just going to end with this for today. The way we really investigate things today is what's known as a biopsychosocial model. Okay. So throughout this class, when we're talking about development, intelligence, social interactions, all of those things, we will take what is the biology that is driving that? Where in the brain is this stuff being developed in your CPU? We'll look at the psychological aspects. What are the thought processes that need to be put in place in order for us to develop, for example, biased thoughts about other people or fair thoughts about people who are more like us? Okay. And then, of course, the social aspect. What is it that the social world is bringing to us that drives a lot of our behavior and mental processes? Okay. All right. With that, I think I went off on things a little bit too much, but all right, I'm going to stop the recording.